This is Holly Page, co-founder of No Labels with No Labels Talks, with my colleague and friend and intellectual guru of politics, Ryan Clancy. Ryan, how you doing this week?
Good. I've never been called an intellectual guru of politics.
It's true. It's true. On one of these podcast introductions, I'd love to actually interview you a little bit and find out how you came to have the worldview and the kind of political view that you have. But we'll save that for another day because we've got some pressing issues.
Yes, there's an election to come because it's after Labor Day, and the old saw is this is when everybody kind of wakes up and starts paying attention.
Exactly. There's no more denying. Pretty soon, 60 days, in fact, we're going to have to make a decision. And then hopefully we'll know in relatively short order.
Well, you got the first debate next week. You have the VP debate will be coming up soon thereafter. There's still an open question, of course, whether there's going to be a second and or third debate between Trump and Harris, though, you know, we could use it because we just still don't know nearly enough about what either of them really want to do.
I was going to say, you and I am sure are abnormal in the amount of news and information we consume. Probably not healthy, but nonetheless. But I still really don't know a lot about particularly what Vice President Harris, what she would do if she were to win. And specifically, I want someone to ask her, what will you stop doing that the Biden administration has done? And what will you do that they don't do? Like, I want to understand where the distinction is.
Yeah, well, plus you also want to hear answers on those, sitting in the Oval Office questions. Hey, if China blockaded Taiwan, what would you do? Are you going to continue sending weapons to Israel or not? Are you going to continue support for Ukraine or not? We should know the answers to those questions.
Absolutely. I'm a little, worried about all of the promises that are being made by both sides of IVF treatments for free or $50,000 tax credits for small businesses. But I was very intrigued and pleased to see that small business was being talked about by the Democratic candidate, because I remember 25 years ago or so, the conventional wisdom was if you make a small business owner, you make a Republican. And the idea was that the Democrats just should stay away from it and talk solely about labor. Yeah. But she really went right in there. And I think it's so important because a vast majority, I think it's like 60 some odd percent of small businesses are started by women and minorities. Yep. It is the way to get on the ladder of prosperity. And so I was happy to see that. I don't know where she's going to get the money to pay for the $50,000 for each new startup, but hopefully we'll hear that detail soon.
That hasn't stopped either her or Trump from being like Oprah in that famous episode where she just gave everybody a car.
Exactly.
That's where we're headed. Well, look, I mean, this is going to be, in so many ways, a kitchen table election. A really other important issue, which is not getting discussed much, which should get discussed, and was really the subject of the podcast today, was just the environment in the country for speech and expression. And we had on Matt Taibbi, formerly of Rolling Stone, now of his own Substack, Racket News. And of course, he's done so much reporting on this. And it's really troublesome. I mean, I don't want to give away too much of what happened on the actual podcast, but if you can imagine a scenario in which a reporter did something that the government found inconvenient and then an IRS agent showed up at his house, you'd say that doesn't happen in America, but it happened to Matt Taibbi.
I think on Christmas Eve.
Is that on Christmas? Yes.
Yeah, on Christmas Eve.
Yes.
He came to my attention because he was one of the very few kind of media journalist people who had a pretty significant platform, who understood the significance of what the establishment, we'll just say that, was doing to No Labels in particular. I mean, he really understood what was really happening. And I happened to bump into him somewhere along the line. And I asked him, why don't more people care? Why don't more people in the media care that basically, in my opinion, the system was being rigged for President Biden to protect him? And, he didn't give me a great answer because there really isn't one, but
Yeah.
I was delighted to have him as our guest today.
Well, yeah, so we get into free speech issues, First Amendment issues. We talk about something obviously we're really concerned about here at No Labels, which is the post-election period and what's going to happen. And is the losing side going to be able to accept that they lost and a lot of other things. So really interesting conversation. Think you're going to like it. So everybody enjoy this week's edition of No Labels Talks with Matt Taibbi. Hello, everybody. This is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, here with another edition of No Labels Talks. And this week, we are joined by Matt Taibbi. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Matt, I suspect a lot of our audience knows who you are, but for those who don't, let me just give a little background. Matt has a longtime journalist, formerly of Rolling Stone, really made his mark doing reporting on the great financial crisis. He's the author of several books, including Hate Inc., among many, many others. But several years ago, he went out on his own, launched his own Substack, where Racket News, I think Matt now has about 500,000 subscribers.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't know what the breakdown is for paid versus unpaid, but yeah, that's right.
So one of the most well-read Substacks. He announced this week he's given a speech, and we were talking about this earlier, September 29th in DC in defense of the First Amendment. And Matt, you write about a lot of different things on Racket News, but you kind of describe the thread that connects all of it as follows, which is so many stories are one way or another about this. You say, America is increasingly governed by a cadre of bureaucrats who believe new technology will allow them to conquer the instinct for self-rule. Talk about that. What does that mean?
Well, I grew up, in Massachusetts in the 70s and 80s. I was kind of a standard ACLU liberal. My mother was an attorney. Actually, she passed the bar when I was a teenager, and so I remember helping her study, and it was around that time that I really gained an appreciation for the Constitution, for the Bill of Rights. And my understanding of what a liberal was always a person who believed kind of implicitly in the guarantees of the Constitution, civil liberties, free speech, right to due process, right to an attorney, all of those things, right? These are canonical ideas on the left once upon a time. And, then I went and lived in Russia for a long time. I was there for a decade and got to see free speech appear and disappear in the space that I was there, and came home to an America where I now see a lot of the tendencies that I once believed in, or a lot of the people who I once thought were supporters of civil liberties, have kind of changed their mind, and they've gone in a different direction. And there's this new belief that I think has become very fashionable, that in order to achieve certain aims, some of them electoral, some of them ideological, that democracy just doesn't work, and that the sort of core Enlightenment ideas that are in the Constitution don't work. And I think there's a belief, and this was borne out in stories like the one I wrote with the Twitter files, that technology can help conquer sort of bad speech, hate speech, bad politics. It can get over the balancing test that the Constitution was once about, which was, we're going to allow a lot of freedom, which means we're going to have a high tolerance for certain kinds of bad behavior, but we do that because we think it's better for the country in the end. Now I think there's a pessimism, and I think that runs through a lot of these things.
Man, I know, again, I think a lot of people listening in are probably familiar with your work on the Twitter files, in which you and other journalists were invited in after Elon Musk bought the platform to review what I guess the best word to describe it would be some pretty significant collusion between the platform and federal agencies and political operatives. Talk about how you got bought into that and what you found when you started digging in?
Basically, Elon Musk took over the company. There started to be rumors pretty quickly that he was going to release internal documentation from the firm. I kind of held my hand up publicly as, hey, if you need somebody to do that, I'm very willing to do it. I got a call to come out to San Francisco. There was really no guidance. It was just, apart from the first one, which was about the Hunter Biden story, it was just look at whatever you want. And when we started to do that, especially in 2020, we instantly saw streams of emails that about content that had sort of notations like flagged by DHS, flagged by FBI, flagged by FITF, which is FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force. And it was just one thing like that after another. And for a journalist, you see the government being involved repeatedly in flagging speech. I thought immediately that was a big story. And as we sort of excavated further, we found that there was a very elaborate bureaucracy, kind of ad hoc bureaucracy that had been created between the enforcement agencies and platforms like Twitter to regulate what appeared on the internet. And it's a complicated story, but that's the rough outline.
But Matt, one of the things I think is really important for people to understand is there is certain content that I suspect most reasonable people would think about and say, I'm fine with that not being on these platforms. Child pornography, terrorist videos. I think the thing that was concerning that you found is that the content that was getting flagged was way downstream from that. It was unconventional views on COVID, which later turned out to actually maybe be right. It was questioning climate science. As you noted, it was questioning the Hunter Biden story. That was what really struck me when I read your reporting on that.
Yeah, and this is where the kind of nexus between journalism and the government urge to try to interfere in the speech landscape is really important, because journalists understand that the initial reaction to a story is often incorrect, right? And that things evolve over time, and that you can't really have an official posture on things and really hope to be right, because everything's fluid. But this new anti-disinformation complex doesn't think that way. They think in terms of things that are politically correct, as opposed to factually correct, which is the distinction that matters in journalism. And one of the things that we realized is it's a lot easier to make those determinations than to make factual determinations. So, for instance, we found correspondence where they would talk about Robert F. Kennedy and other what they called repeat offenders, and they would say content from these people is almost always reportable. So just the person is bad, right? Like, that's just the concept that doesn't exist in journalism. Like, people who are wrong sometimes can be right other times, but that's not how they think, right?
It's kind of like, that Minority Report, the movie, right? Where they identify the crime before it happens.
There is a lot of Minority Report thinking especially in the kind of algorithmic constructions that they've come up with. So one of the things we found was they had a list, what they call a deny list in Twitter, which is where you're de-amplified if you're on this list. They had one that was called is_Russian. And what that meant was your account hit a certain number of mathematical parameters. You had been retweeted X number of times by the wrong people, or the wrong Russian account retweeted you. And so that put people like Julian Assange and Jill Stein in Russian is underscore Russian bucket, because they were basically pre-concluding that these people were going to have messages that were negative or that were incorrect or that needed to be de-amplified. Whereas again, the thing that's so important about the free speech landscape is that minority views very often turn out to be the really important ones in penetrating kind of public deceptions, especially about big things like WMDs or the Gulf of Tonkin or whatever it is, right? It's the unpopular voices that you have to keep track of. They don't think that way.
Yeah, and Matt, you've noted there is this very specific language, and we constantly hear the phrase misinformation, disinformation, and they have very specific meanings in the context of these digital surveillance infrastructures. One of the things you pointed out is that increasingly it just becomes a catch-all terminology to censor things the government finds inconvenient in some fashion, right?
Yeah, so the Department of Homeland Security, they had a subcommittee they called the MDM subcommittee, which is misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Now, malinformation explicitly does not involve false information. It is usually true information, but that is what they call misleading, right? So, for instance, an example of malinformation might be somebody takes the vaccine and dies, and they think that is malinformation because it promotes hesitancy. It produces the wrong political result. So that's malinformation. Disinformation, which used to have a very concrete connotation in intelligence, and it's based on a Russian word, desinformatia, where it's an intelligence service trying to make people in another country believe something untrue. Now they've kind of tweaked that, and now it can be, it's a bad actor who can use both true and untrue material to try to mislead people into a wrong opinion. The only one of those three things that absolutely necessarily has false information is misinformation, and even that they're a little fuzzy there. So it's a very tricky little science, and all the time it's moving in the direction not of factual error but of provenance and political impact.
I think probably a question a lot of people ask themselves is why this is happening. And you've got an idea on that, and you talked about an interview you did, which is the rise of Trump has created what you described as a brand new belief system in the media. And by the way, to put this on the table, because you have, even though you came from Rolling Stone and you used to get called a liberal journalist, you've now started to get branded a conservative journalist, even though you wrote a book about Trump called Insane Clown President.
Yeah.
I think that would give you some priors that you're not a Trump propagandist. And yet that is really the origin in a lot of ways, right, of all this, that the necessity to stop Trump justifies all these things we're talking about.
Yeah, there was a very influential column in the New York Times in August of 2016 called "Trump is Testing the Norms of Objectivity in Journalism." And the premise of the article was that Trump was such a big threat that it was no longer important just to be true for journalists. We had to be true to history's judgment. So that, the old ethos in journalism, and I grew up in this, my father was a reporter, I grew up around reporters my whole life. We're not supposed to care. The whole idea is, as long as we confirm that something's true, which by the way is a very hard job in itself, we put it out there and then we trust the public to use that true information to make good informed political decisions. And when Trump won the nomination, there was this rip in that belief system, I think, in the popular media. The new idea was, oh my God, the public is not getting the proper message. They're not making the right decisions. So we need to change the way we do business and give them a new formula that will lead them more in the direction of making the right decisions. So I think Brexit was important there, and then Trump getting elected was very important. But the problem is this is a total misread of how communications work, because when you start trying to force people in a direction, as anybody who's ever done rhetoric of any kind knows, the opposite happens. People tend to rebel against manipulation or any kind of force, and they will do the opposite of what you tell them. And that was a big reason that Trump got elected, I think.
Yeah.
I
mean, Matt, you and I and some other folks from No Labels, I mean, we talked, I think probably about 7-8 months ago when we were in the midst of trying to get ballot access. And this is another thing you've written about, is that so much of what we're talking about, these efforts to censor speech, the efforts to just make sure No Labels couldn't get on the ballot, to do the same thing to Robert F. Kennedy,
unbelievable.
is done under the aegis of protecting our democracy. That is the kind of catch-all for all of this, and yet the tactics that are being used. And look, you wrote about this a year ago. The lawfare, the way that it's just increasingly being used to narrow people's choices. And again, it's because our betters decided, we kind of know what choices are best for you, and you can vote, but you can vote within a certain acceptable context, and there's certain candidates you really shouldn't get to vote for.
Yeah, and this is all rooted in this weird kind of snobism. When I first started covering presidential campaigns, I remember this very graphically. It was 2004. I was in Houston, and there had been, I think, a debate, and I was on the bus with all the campaign reporters. Occasionally we really do have a bus. There is a boys on the bus thing. And after the event, I came back there, and all the heavy hitters from the New York Times, CNN, all these big companies were sitting around and kind of discussing, well, which one of these candidates do we think is serious? Which ones are we going to describe as fringe? Which ones are we going to say is a hopeful, right? There were all these code words for telling the public how they should respond to a candidate. And I didn't understand this at the time, but there is this built-in belief system among a lot of sort of the upper class in this country. And journalism, by the way, is almost all now Ivy League folk, that when the general public doesn't follow our instructions, that means something's gone wrong. And when Trump got elected, that whole system of people taking direction, they saw as being broken and in need of some kind of stronger repair. Whereas what I see is that when people vote for alternative candidates, whether it's Ron Paul or Bernie Sanders or Dennis Kucinich or Ralph Nader or No Labels or Bobby Kennedy or whatever it is, it's 99% of the time it's a reasoned calculation by a voter that the usual choices are no longer going to do anything for them. And it's a healthy response, I think, when they make those decisions most of the time, right? Even it's usually defensible. They just don't see it that way. I think this is very strongly like a class and bureaucratic sort of snobism thing that has become more pervasive in political attitudes now.
But Matt, what I want to ask you is, who or what among our political leaders are the constituency left to champion these things you're saying we should all care about? Actually protecting democracy, not just saying it, actually protecting the First Amendment. You have said recently, based on their statements, that neither Kamala Harris or Tim Walz seem to understand the First Amendment. We've also seen plenty of instances, though, where Republican leaders, especially at the state level, when you look at they're trying to get books out of libraries and everything else, they don't understand it either. But both sides at different points in time and for different reasons seem more than willing to shut down speech they find inconvenient. There doesn't seem many people that actually, as a matter of principle, are willing to say, I'm going to stand up for the right to speak your mind, even if I vehemently disagree with it.
Yeah, unfortunately, one's views on speech tend to, most of the time now, it seems like it tracks with whether or not they think they're being censored. So there has certainly been an accelerated appreciation for the First Amendment among Trump Republicans in the last 8 years, maybe more so even than the candidate himself. Sometimes Donald Trump says crazy things about speech. He threatens to lock people up who don't cover him correctly. I have learned over the years that I'm not always sure that he's serious about those things, but certainly those statements are concerning. We've seen people in Congress who have voted for very, very restrictive speech laws. The anti-Semitism law that they passed in Congress was, kind of at odds with traditional speech values. The FISA enhancements thing that just went through is a little bit scary as well. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Who's that person who's going to stand up just for the core idea? I mean, I know Tulsi Gabbard, like I've talked to her about this. Sometimes I think she's a true believer in that kind of stuff. But it used to be not hard to find politicians who believed in it, and now it is, and that's what's so strange. I mean, even 15 years ago, if you just went to a walk through the Cannon office building in DC, you would run into a First Amendment supporter pretty quickly. Now, I don't know. I mean, what's your experience on that? I'm curious because I think it's changed.
Well, I mean, Matt, one of the things I'd love if you could share with everybody, because it's an example of something that happened to you that I think most of us, we grew up, in the same, I'm a little younger than you, but I grew up with the same set of sensibilities. There's some things that that have been happening recently, and one thing that happened to you that you'd say to yourself, I actually can't believe that happened in our country. And that is, maybe you could share with people the visit you got from the IRS after you reported the Twitter files and then testified in front of the House.
Yeah, so I did the Twitter file story. I got invited to testify before Jim Jordan's, weaponization of government committee in the House. I took an Amtrak down to Washington, testified. It was a very bizarre hearing. We can get into that if you want, but and the irony is I was testifying about abuse of state power, right? I mean, it was about censorship, but that's what it was about. I get back on Amtrak that same night, and my wife says to me, "Oh yeah, the IRS came to the house while you were testifying, and they left this note on my door." And it really happened. It turned out, first of all, they have a tactic where they tell you to call back in 4 days or 5 days because they want you to freak out over the weekend. So they won't answer your calls until you've had time to worry.
They really do that. It's like
Yeah.
it's a way to mess with your head.
Yep, I've actually talked to Treasury people who told me that that's a thing. So that's
Okay.
what it said on my note. And then, I told the committee this happened, and so Jordan wrote to the Treasury, and they ended up making a big policy change, at least theoretically, about reducing the number of home visits as a result of that. Now, it wasn't until we got the answer from the Treasury that I actually thought this was a real thing. I thought it had to be a coincidence because it's too absurd. Like, that doesn't happen in America. But they opened the case on me on Christmas Eve of the year before, which just happened to be a day when I dropped the biggest Twitter file story, I think, and it was a Saturday, and it was snowing. I mean, it was just very strange for them to pick that particular day. So that makes me wonder for sure.
Yeah. Matt, I want to ask you before we get to some questions. One of the things No Labels is really concerned about, and we have some House allies who are going to be coming out next week making a statement about this,
Great.
is the post-election period. And the possibility that there's going to be a big chunk of the country that is not going to be willing to move on. Now, it's not hard to imagine Trump losing, refusing to accept the results, and then having something analogous to a repeat to the run up to January 6th, and God forbid, something like that. But one of the things I don't think people might be aware of is the possibility that we might have the same problem on the other side. If Trump wins, will enough Democrats actually accept it? And I want to play a clip here that my colleague Marianne is going to bring up. This is Jamie Raskin, who is the Democratic congressman from Maryland.
And the greatest example going on right now before our very eyes is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which they're just disappearing with a magic wand, as if it doesn't exist, even though it could not be clearer what it's stating. And so, you know, they want to kick it to Congress, so it's going to be up to us on January 6, 2025 to tell the rampaging Trump mobs that he's disqualified. And then we need bodyguards for everybody and civil war conditions, all because.
Now, just so everybody's clear, 14th Amendment, this is sort of commonly known as the insurrection clause. This is the legal foundation by which the Secretaries of State of Maine and Colorado tried to kick Trump off the ballot. That, Matt, is not isolated. So we did a little research. There was an Atlantic article from January of this year in which they asked several senior House Democrats, would you commit to certifying on next January 6th, 2025, if Trump won? And none of them were willing to say definitively that they would. I mean, what is your reaction to that? You've written a lot about Raskin before.
Yeah, so I when I first saw that clip, I didn't believe. I thought it had to be like an AI thing. Like, why would a serving member of Congress say that out loud? But this is the environment in which we live. Yeah, it is something to worry about. I wrote a story about a thing called the Transition Integrity Project, which is fascinating, really, right? Like what happened is that in 2020, in the run-up to the 2020 election, there was suddenly this spate of stories about this group of people who had conducted a tabletop exercise about post-election scenarios, and they were actively trying to promote this story. The people who had done this tabletop exercise, a lot of them were kind of former well-known Democrats. People like John Podesta was involved. Michael Steele, the former RNC chairman, was another. But they didn't give the people the actual results of the tabletop exercise. They just sort of set the propaganda idea behind telling everybody about it was that, oh my God, we're so concerned that Donald Trump is not going to accept the election results that we gathered 100 people to prepare for what to do if that happens. But Ben Smith of the New York Times, who's a very good media reporter, somehow got hold of the actual Transition Integrity Project report and found that when they did all these war games, they had people. John Podesta played the role of Joe Biden, and there were scenarios, for instance, where there was a popular vote win for Biden, but an electoral vote defeat. An electoral vote win for Trump and a popular vote win for Biden. And the Biden side secede, like they have a block of states secede, then there are phony street demonstrations that are started, and then they negotiate basically whether or not they're going to accept a Trump presidency. And then there are numerous scenarios like this where they're contemplating, well, what do we do if we don't want to accept the result? And so these are discussions that are happening. Now, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, just yesterday, in giving a press conference about election security, noted that the DOJ has been conducting its own tabletop exercises for next year. So what do those entail? I'd love to do a FOIA request and find out about that. But certainly behind the scenes, there are a lot of people who are having thoughts that I think would have been unthinkable in America 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess, Matt, here's the question. I mean, what is, as we look out 2 months, I mean, what is the way out of this? And again, this gets to the concern No Labels is really thinking about. In fact, we're hosting an event about a month after the election called the One Nation Conference. And the thinking is it's going to be a gathering place for House and Senate members that in this environment where we're very worried, we're going to have people not willing to move on, not turn the page, that we could get hopefully a critical mass of people willing to say the election is over, we need to accept the results. But the rhetoric is so hot in this election. You have Democrats being told every single day, this is basically Germany in the 1930s. Our democracy is dead if this guy wins. Look, on the other side, you know, Trump is telling people that we're going to turn into Venezuela tomorrow. If Kamala Harris gets elected. I mean, I don't think in 1996 anybody was saying I'm moving to Canada if Bob Dole wins.
Right.
Right? It's just the stakes seem so much higher. How do we get through this post-election period without a really frightening episode of civil unrest? It's hard to see how we're avoiding that at this point.
I don't know. I mean, I do think that, you know, parties like No Labels have an important role in this, because a lot of the problems that we have in terms of public confidence in elections surrounds issues like ballot access and electoral security. You know, in Europe, most countries use paper ballots, right? And so there isn't this terror that there are going to be faked results, or that somebody is going to miscount them, that could have runs rampantly here in the States. There aren't going to be, you know, sort of dueling accusations of disenfranchisement, you know, if we let everybody who wants to run. And this election season, we saw, not just with No Labels, not just with Bobby Kennedy, but also just within the Democratic Party, we saw these amazing things happen where, you know, we had whole primaries canceled. Florida canceled its primary, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, New Hampshire held a primary and then held a second thing they called a nominating event, where they just sort of sent in new results. Very weird, right? And so I think there needs to be some kind of reform that gives people confidence that voting is respected and accurate, and, you know, and not being controlled by, you know, non-transparent organizations. Let's put it that way, because we didn't have that fear before, and I don't know how we get there. But you know, that's another thing I'd be curious to hear. But it is a problem.
Well, I mean, the other thing, and the last thing I'll mention before we get into questions is, you know, America obviously exists in this much broader context, and you've been writing about this, and you were talking with Barry Weiss about this recently. If you look globally, there is so much backsliding on these issues of core liberties, on speech. Just to cite just three examples, the CEO of Telegram, a messaging app, was just arrested in France. X, formerly Twitter, was just banned in Brazil. In the UK now, you can be thrown in jail for spreading harmful content. And again, harmful is one of those catch-all misinformation, disinformation phrases that can kind of mean what the government wants. People have been thrown in jail for a wayward social media post. So there is clearly a momentum. I guess my question, Matt, is this is obviously not just an American thing.
No.
So why is this happening everywhere now?
So there was a great book that was written called The Revolt of the Public by Martin Gurry, who was a former CIA analyst, believe it or not. And
You talked to Martin.
did you? Okay.
Yeah, he called Trump before Trump, basically.
Right. Yeah. Basically, the book, which I think came out in 2015, maybe 2014, it predicts Trump without Trump even being a character in the book. And what it says is new information technology has given the public everywhere more information to analyze the performance of their governments. And they have found, with this increased access, that their governments are terrible, or that they're massively underperforming, or that they're corrupt, or that there are other problems. And so they see the warts that they did not see before. And this has led to more and more rejection of kind of ruling powers in all these different countries. Sometimes it's the left that revolts, sometimes it's the right, but all over the world we see these movements. There's the Catalan independence movement, right? There's the Yellow Vest movement. There's Viktor Orban in France. There was a leftist movement in Greece. Whatever it is, Occupy here in the States, Tea Party here in the States, all this starts rising to the surface, and so governments don't know what to do about it. I think their response is to treat it as a security problem, when actually what they really need to do is be better at what they do,
Yeah.
and do better for the public. And so we're at this place where they have given up on trying to get the public to support them through the traditional means of just being better. And they have moved into this place of using the most draconian tools available to them, some of which they already had. Like in the UK, what you cited, they've had that law in the books since 1986. They just haven't done it because, who would, right? Unless you were absolutely backed into a corner or thought you were. And so I think that's what's going on now, is that
Yeah.
people everywhere are using the most dramatic tools, and we have a lot of them too, by the way. And that's one of the scary things.
Well, it is, and but it makes you appreciate how rare the First Amendment is. It is
Right.
very far from universal, especially in Europe, which does not have this tradition of free speech protections. Matt, you mind if we open up to a couple of questions?
Sure, and just quickly about that though, I mean that's going to be the subject of my speech in Washington is pretty soon. Is what makes the First Amendment special is that we're not these other countries. We have this unique thing, and that's why it's so important to protect it, because if that goes, a lot of things will go.
It's the First Amendment for a reason.
Right.
If you could just say your name and where you're from.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dirk Lazier from Idaho. Matt, follow your stuff. Love it. Keep it up.
Thank you, Dirk.
Two quick questions.
Mhm.
First of all, this is not my invitation to extend, and I'm not asking about whether you personally would be interested in this project or not. But do you think it would be useful for the American political body to have a no labels unity ticket files series of articles written? Because I think, I personally think that would be very, very interesting. And so that's question number one. Question number two is there a place where the Xbox file, the Twitter files have been pulled together such that they can be read by somebody who wasn't following them concurrently with their release?
Well, I'll answer to the second question first. On my site, racket.news, there is a heading that says the Twitter files, but it's only the ones that I did. So that's roughly, like 60% of them, maybe. All of that stuff is there. It's all free. Most of the Twitter files are still on Twitter. So if you look for each of the accounts, for Barry Weiss, Li Fong did some of them, you'll still find them, but we have not organized. It's sad to say we have not put them all in one place.
Is that an idea that you and Barry and others are considering? Because
we should definitely do that. And I think it's probably even worth creating a whole site for it, because in addition to the actual reports, we also have kind of this evolving, we still have like 190,000 emails that we haven't put out. And so there's going to be more stuff that comes out. And there's also FOIA materials that we've generated in response to a lot of these things. So, Yeah, it would be great to, maybe I've actually considered investing some money in having somebody do that.
I would
Um,
encourage you to do that.
thanks. Maybe I think that would be a good idea. Um, but as to the first thing, the for no labels files, you mean like the legal correspondence back and forth and that sort of thing, like
Yeah, I guess
everything that's on the docket?
here's my view, which is no labels and Dean Phillips and Kennedy are all subject to tremendous uh, bad behavior on the part of various uh, people claiming to defend democracy. Some of it is lawfare, some of it is other types of intimidation. And I guess my question would be, I don't think that that's received the public awareness that it needs to have. And I'm curious, again, not my invitation to extend, and I'm not asking you whether you personally would volunteer to do it the way you did with Twitter, but do you think it would be useful to have a collection, whether a book or a pamphlet or long column or whatever, that says, you guys might not believe it, but here's what happened to no labels, here's what happened to Dean Phillips, and here's what happened to Kennedy by parties on both sides.
Uh, um, I think somebody's unmuted. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. In fact, if you're up for working with somebody at my site and helping compile that stuff, for me the restriction is just like how much time do I have to actually write it. But if we can help put it together, I think absolutely that would be a really useful thing to put out, whether it's on social media or on a site. I mean, there are lots of different ways to present it, or you could do it in video form. But if somebody's willing to raise their hand and help compile the stuff for us, I can devote a little bit. I can have somebody start getting it together on my side for sure.
We did not pay Dirk to ask that question.
No, but I think it's a good idea. I like the idea.
But for those of you who haven't, Matt did write about some of this several months ago, especially in the wake of that Semaphore article where the script leaked of what, if you listen to the audio file, it was audio file leaked of the groups conspiring against us. It really did sound like listening in on a mafia wiretap.
Oh my God,
the way
yeah.
John Gotti would talk about whacking some guy who, didn't pay him the vig that week or something. It really was.
Oh no, the thing about Holly and the bits about the client and everything. I mean, that's part of the affidavit, right? But no, all of those behaviors, it's like gangland behavior, right? And the ballot access stuff is just very thinly disguised intimidation, I think, if it's even disguised at all. I think they're actually proud of the fact that they're trying to discourage people by fear from getting involved in third-party politics. So, yeah, that was a shocking story for me.
Oh, they are. I mean, there have been several stories where Mark Elias, who's kind of the lead Democratic election lawyer, and he will just, NBC did a big story about this. After they got rid of us, there was a big story about now we're turning our sights to Robert F. Kennedy, and we're just going to do everything we can to knock him off the ballot.
And again, here's the part that I don't get about that. Okay, fine, Mark Elias, he's a Democratic Party lawyer, but what I don't get is the servile enthusiasm of all the press outlets who are sort of doing yay team for some lawyer who's trying to strike a candidate off the ballot. And obviously this was true even before no labels came on the scene, but once upon a time that would have excited outrage with most reporters. I think now they're just on board.
Yeah, well, it goes back to what you said. The new belief system justifies that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm Kim from Massachusetts, and I actually worked with No Labels on their Unity ticket proposal, and my daughter is in the media. Ricky Schlott, I think she might have done some stuff with you. Matt.
Oh.
But so I bring that up because I'm wondering, between the media and efforts such as No Labels, where is the opportunity to create a stronger middle center to compete with this duopoly? Because I see the Democrats, the Republicans have strength and the media to back them. And we in the center, all the polling data shows that 70 to 80% of us lie somewhere in the middle there. And we have voices like you and Barry Weiss, and even people like Megyn Kelly coming from the right, or even Chris Cuomo now has, a more moderate centrist voice in News Nation. All these people who represent the middle, Andrew Yang and No Labels, I don't see us all coming together and uniting in a way to actually effectively disrupt the duopoly. How do we do that? Where do you see the opportunity there, Matt?
Well, first of all, Kim, thanks for the question. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity right now to do that, because there has never been a situation where the public has been more ready to embrace something else than right now. They're not just curious, they are enraged, right? Like and I started to see this 8 years ago, that there were people out there who were, just hopping mad at the ineffectual nature of how the American political system works. Now, the choices are so limited, but also people realize that it's been artificially narrowed, both politically and informationally. And so I think almost anybody who's probably in this Zoom, if you were actually on the ticket and got anything like fair coverage, you'd probably win the presidential election this year. So it's old school politics. I don't really know a whole lot about how this works, but you got to get on the ballot first, which I think you've done. You've already done a lot of that work. And then the next thing is just to find a candidate who can draw some attention. And the one great thing about the current environment, and unfortunately this is changing, by the day, is that anybody who has any kind of media skill at all can generate attention without the help of traditional news media pretty well, right? I mean, they'll be suppressed, but if they make a good representation of themselves, they will get audience. I just think it's a moment where you have to believe that it's going to work, and as long I talk to people. I live in a small town in New Jersey, and talk to parents, at the school where my kids go. And most people, as you say, fall into this area where they have the same general beliefs about stuff and they'll vote for somebody who is just in a certain space, not advancing anything terribly radical, and just for strengthening our system and going about our business. I think that would be enormously appealing, honestly. And you shouldn't be discouraged by all these obstacles that are put up, because the kind of the opposition to this is a mile wide but a millimeter deep, is my impression. The public is just so ready for this, I think.
Matt, thanks for that. Thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Change when no